Okay, the Subcommittee on Intelligence and Counterterrorism will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony on confronting the rise in anti-Semitic domestic terrorism, Part 2. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the subcommittee in recess at any point. Without objection, members not on the subcommittee shall be permitted to sit and question the witnesses. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Of course, thank you so much to our extraordinary slate of witnesses from the FBI and Department of Homeland Security for coming here today to testify on the federal government's response to the rise in anti-Semitic domestic terrorism. And I'm sure in the process we'll also be focusing on generally the issue of domestic terrorism. This is not a question of either or. Okay, we are not losing sight of jihadi terrorism and the threat that it continues to pose, but there is no doubt these statistics do not lie. The rise of domestic terrorism and the anti-Semitic threads running through it are an incredibly real problem. I've got people in my community, people in communities throughout this country that are afraid to go outside wearing their kippah, afraid to congregate, afraid to observe the high holy days, and people generally are now afraid to do things that they were not afraid to do just a few years ago. We have certainly seen the rise of a global neo-Nazi, white nationalist movement that is deserving of our attention. Many people, experts, have said that this looks like what Al-Qaeda looked like in the 80s and the 90s. Let's not find ourselves asleep at the wheel as we did in the run-up to 9/11. For so many people in my community, it feels like 9/11 was yesterday. These organizations, it is my opinion, and I'm not the only one, need to be identified as foreign terrorist organizations. And if they are not identified as foreign terrorist organizations, you need to tell us that we are still protected. We need to know that when people in America go to train overseas, when people in America are recruited, when people try to come to America who have trained with these organizations, that you have the same tools at your disposal that you do and have had in the fight against jihadi terrorism. That is not too much to ask on behalf of the American people. And so with that, I will move on to your testimonies. I have no more highlighted things. So the chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate your passion in this area and the fine job that you're doing in this area. And I appreciate you scheduling today's hearing to follow up on the federal efforts to address anti-Semitism and domestic terrorism. Just last month, we had the opportunity to hear directly from faith-based organizations, think tanks, and others on the growing threat of anti-Semitic rhetoric and violence basically around the world. Witnesses testified about growing threats to their communities from a wide variety of hateful ideologies and the need for more federal coordination and support. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished panel about ongoing federal efforts to combat domestic extremism and terrorism. Earlier this month, FBI Director Wray testified that the Bureau had elevated racially motivated violent extremism to a threat level on par, kind of what Chairman Rose was talking about it, with Islamist terrorism. In response, the FBI has established a new fusion cell to better coordinate the response to domestic terrorism and hate crimes, and joint terrorism task forces across the United States have been instructed to increase their focus on domestic terrorism. I want to welcome the new FBI Assistant Director of the Counterterrorism Division, Jill Sanborn, for her, I believe, her first appearance before the Homeland Security Committee. Similarly, the Department of Homeland Security has taken a number of actions to expand efforts to address domestic terrorism. In April of 2019, I believe DHS launched the new Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention, or TVTP, to coordinate efforts across the department and focus on building prevention capabilities. This office is also working with FEMA to administer the new TVTP grant program. DHS also released the first strategic framework for countering terrorism and targeted violence, which is a holistic review of DHS's counterterrorism capabilities and how they can be utilized to address targeted violence and domestic extremism. Look forward to hearing more about the implementation plans today for all of these efforts and how DHS will expand information sharing and outreach efforts with very important faith-based communities. I applaud the great work that is being done by this administration. It is clear that it is taking the increased domestic extremism threats seriously. I remain steadfast in my commitment to an open and bipartisan discussion about domestic terrorism and hateful ideologies, and my quest or my search for meaningful recommendations for addressing these very real threats to our homeland. We have and we must continue to work in a bipartisan fashion to help provide the necessary tools to our communities that address these complex problems. I thank the witnesses for appearing here today, and I yield back the balance of my time. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you for your extraordinary partnership in dealing with this issue. I now welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Ms. Jill Sanborn, Assistant Director of the Counterterrorism Division of the FBI. And Ms. Sanborn, I understand that you're the first woman to hold this position, and we congratulate you on this tremendous, tremendous achievement. Our second witness is Ms. Elizabeth Newman, Assistant Secretary for Threat Prevention and Security Policy in the Office of Strategy, Policy, and Plans at DHS. Our third and final witness is Mr. Brian Harrell, Assistant Director for Infrastructure Security at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, at DHS. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Assistant Director Sanborn.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Jill Sanborn. It's always an honor to be on the Hill, where I started my public service as a Senate page back in 1987. As of last week, I am now the Assistant Director of the FBI's Counterterrorism Division. I spent the last couple of years as a special agent in charge of the Bureau's Minneapolis Division, where I had the honor of overseeing FBI operations in Minnesota and the Dakotas. While I was sad to leave the great folks working the upper Midwest, I am equally happy to be here focusing on the counterterrorism fight once again. As the members of this committee are well aware, preventing acts of terrorism, domestic or international, continues to be the FBI's #1 priority. The FBI takes very seriously all acts of terrorism from any place, by any actor, against any person. Multiple fatal attacks, from a church in Charleston in 2015 to a synagogue in Poway just last year, underscore the continuing threat currently facing faith-based communities in the United States. And the threat itself is diverse. In the last 18 months, Jewish communities have been targeted and threatened by violent extremists across the terrorism spectrum. It is widely known that there are groups that want to do harm to Americans. But the greatest threat we face today is the one posed by lone actors of any ideology, who are typically radicalized online and look to attack soft targets with easily accessible weapons. The solitary nature of their radicalization and mobilization makes them particularly difficult to identify and disrupt before they take their opportunity to act. More often than not, we are seeing that these people are motivated and inspired by a mix of ideological, social, political, and personal grievances against their targets. While identifying the ideology of the person helps us understand their motivation, our ability to prevent an attack seems to rely heavily on recognizing warning signs or indicators that someone is actually mobilizing toward an act of terrorism. In a recent FBI study of successful attackers, in each case, at least one person saw a change in the attacker's behavior before the attack unfolded. And unfortunately, people in the United States are often inspired by attacks abroad. Attacks like the one in Christchurch, New Zealand last year could and have incited others to conduct a similar attack here in the US. In fact, we have seen some domestic terror subjects reference foreign individuals over the course of their own radicalization process, as well as attempt to live stream their attacks, mirroring what they have seen overseas attackers do. The internet transcends borders, so too do the ideas that are propagated on it. To that end, we have seen some domestic terrorism subjects travel overseas, some to conflict zones, for combat training. It's for these reasons and many more that the FBI commits significant resources to the fight against terrorism, both here and abroad. Regardless of where it happens, how it happens, or who does it, terrorism is terrorism. I would like to thank all of our partners, including the members of this committee, who work with us to keep the American people safe. We do not and cannot fight this battle alone. Our people are collaborating and communicating at a high level in joint terrorism task forces across the country, and also within the numerous fusion centers throughout the nation. In my career, I have worked with many fusion centers, to include some in your districts, and the work we are doing together there is simply amazing. In fact, information provided by the Fusion Center in Orange County, California, led us to predicate cases that recently resulted in 7 arrests of members of the base across 4 different states. Collectively, we are working around the clock to push out real-time intelligence to federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial agencies. This collaboration will continue to be vital as we face new trends in the threat. Our partnerships include non-law enforcement agencies, from tech companies to faith-based organizations like the Anti-Defamation League. I can tell you from my time in the Upper Midwest, one of our best partners was and still is the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas. These relationships are working. In just the first quarter of this fiscal year, these types of partnerships have assisted JTTFs across the country in disrupting and arresting 38 terrorism subjects right here in the United States. In closing, I want to thank you for your continued support of the men and women of the FBI. I am honored to be here with you today to discuss the issues facing our communities, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Assistant Secretary Newman to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rose, Ranking Member Walker, Congresswoman Slotkin, and Congressman Malinowski, I have appreciated each of your attention, your leadership to this issue, and I appreciate you holding this hearing today. Last summer, I toured Auschwitz-Birkenau death camps, and to prepare, I read multiple survivors' memoirs, but really nothing can prepare you for the size and the scale of those camps. The more harrowing thing I found was that there was a methodical approach to annihilating groups of people that were deemed less than. I was struggling with, how do people devolve into such depravity? How quickly pride, which is that part of ourselves that says, I'm better than, which we all struggle with, it is the original sin, but how quickly pride leads to anger, then hate, and then to violence, if properly stoked and unchecked. How quickly a small group of empowered people, take just the prison guards at one camp, they had to buy into the justification, a sick rationale to bring themselves to kill millions of people in a systematic fashion. You see, they didn't see fellow men and women. They didn't see the children, reminding them of their own sons and daughters and nieces and nephews. Those coming off sealed cattle car trains were the other, a manifestation of a profound breakdown of societal bonds into 2 camps, us and them. While many scholars and philosophers have expanded on this idea far better than I can, experiencing it at Auschwitz left me with a renewed purpose to root out such division within our country. Anti-Semitism and similar ideologies of hatred and the violence perpetrated in their name have a chilling effect on Americans' ability and willingness to openly exercise their Constitution's guaranteed rights. These individuals support ideologies that seek to create the other here in the United States, and we cannot let that happen. Last June, I had the privilege of testifying before another subcommittee, and I made a commitment that DHS would develop a strategy to counter the threat of domestic terrorism. And in September, DHS released that strategy, the Strategic Framework for Countering Terrorism and Targeted Violence, which describes the threat from domestic terrorism, particularly racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism, as growing and needing to be addressed in the same way we've addressed the foreign terrorist challenge. It calls for us to update the tools and expertise that have protected and strengthened our country the past 17 years from foreign terrorists to address the threat from domestic terrorism and targeted violence. As I testified at an earlier panel, increasingly, as testified in one of your earlier panels, increasingly this threat is transnational. Thus, we are exploring how to leverage our existing CT authorities to combat terrorist travel against any foreign threat actors seeking to conduct violence. At DHS, we work closely with the State Department, who has the statutory authority for designating groups as foreign terrorist organizations. For any groups that are designated, DHS then implements relevant screening and vetting measures. While designations of certain overseas groups may help us address some of these challenges, the lack of a designation does not prevent the department from applying its authorities under the INA to disrupt travel of violent extremists. We have several examples of skilled CBP officers preventing foreign nationals with ties to neo-Nazi groups overseas from entering the country due to being deemed inadmissible under the INA. Finally, we are seeing foreign-based groups attempting to influence and motivate U.S.-based individuals through a variety of extremist ideologies in an effort to sow discord in the U.S. as well as incite violence. It is critical that we educate the American public and build resilience to these malign influence campaigns. We are still early in this process, and it is a process which needs to be done carefully to ensure we operate within the bounds of existing authorities. But please know that our operators are actively working to prevent individuals seeking to harm our citizens from entering the country. But the strategic framework also called for DHS to create new tools, new capabilities to address the threat of terrorism and targeted violence. It redefines what we mean by prevention and calls for scaling the prevention mission across the United States. Prevention efforts, in short, are locally based solutions centered on accepted threat assessment and management approaches. We are assisting law enforcement and communities to offer voluntary counsel and help to susceptible individuals before they commit a crime or violent act. The strategy also highlights that we need to do a better job countering the online influence of violent extremists, as witnesses on previous panels discussed in depth. Thanks to funding provided by you in fiscal year 20, we are already beginning to scale the prevention mission this year. That effort is underway and described in more detail in our written statement for the record. Further, the President's budget for FY21 requests additional increases for prevention. We are headed in the right direction, and I'm hopeful that these efforts in time will lead to a reduction in violence in our communities. But let me end with this. While I am passionate about DHS's approach to preventing violence, I am also realistic about how much government can do. At its core, hate is a heart problem, and government can only do so much about heart problems. We need engaged citizens, communities of faith, and leaders in communities, nonprofits, corporations, academia, technology, and government to stand up against this evil. In his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech in 1986, Elie Wiesel, a survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau's death camps, said, "We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant." Thank you for holding this hearing, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Assistant Director Harrell to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rose, Ranking Member Walker, and members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for having me today. The cornerstone of America's democracy is a free and open society where people can live without fear of harm. Americans expect to be safe and secure as they conduct their daily lives. Most importantly, there are certain foundational rights within the Constitution that must be protected. These freedoms, including the right to practice a religion of choice, are integral to the American way of life. Unfortunately, the persistent pressures from domestic and international terrorists and other violent extremist actors aim to threaten the fabric of America's democracy. Differences in ideology materialize in targeted violent attacks as demonstrated by recent events against faith-based communities. Throughout the past few years, we have seen significant security incidents involving houses of worship, schools, and other soft targets in crowded places. We have seen the face of evil, but we've also seen the face of courage. Courage has materialized in the response of our law enforcement, our community business partners, our fellow worshipers, and our faith leaders. The department is committed to mitigating the risk of attacks on our homeland, and our mission is critical to the nation's counterterrorism efforts. The protection of our people and our infrastructure is a vital component of the department's strategic framework. Through the resources provided by CISA, DHS continues our long-standing efforts with communities to share threat information, harden public gathering locations, train law enforcement and first responders, and conduct a wide range of training and exercises. We do not magically get better in a time of crisis. We always default to the things that we know, to training, to the lessons learned from exercises. These are proven initiatives that have enhanced the safety and security of the American people, and through the strategic framework, DHS is augmenting its capabilities to address this increased targeted violence against our communities. To ensure the safety and security of our worshipers, we must be innovative, provide timely and useful resources, and increase information sharing. CISA is at the forefront of this work. Our Hometown Security Initiative provides direct, tangible support to hardened public gathering locations. Leveraging its field personnel and program offices, CISA shares information on the evolving threat. including prominent and emerging tactics. We conduct security and threat vulnerability assessments, and we offer resources to how to mitigate and drive down the risk of violent attacks. In the last 3 fiscal years, CISA has conducted 1,534 engagements with faith-based organizations, primarily through its Protective Security Advisor program. In 2019 alone, CISA conducted over 800 engagements with houses of worship, progressively increasing our outreach since 2017. Just last week, DHS, in partnership with DOJ, HHS, and the Department of Education, released to the public the schoolsafety.gov website, further demonstrating the department's commitment to giving the appropriate security resources to those that can have an impact. CISA's resources help inform local decision-making. The agency shares information aimed at reducing the impacts of an active shooter incident. This information focuses on suspicious behavioral indicators, potential attack methods, how to develop an emergency action plan, actions that may be taken during an incident, and how to quickly and effectively recover from an incident. Since 2011, CISA has conducted more than 300 in-person active shooter workshops throughout this country, teaching over 41,000 participants. Nearly 975,000 people have successfully completed our online active shooter training. And our active shooter website on dhs.gov has been seen and viewed over 4.5 million times. Our PSA has conducted more than 5,000 active shooter activities throughout this country, and many of them revolve around the faith-based organizations. Following the strategic attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, members of the synagogue credited the training provided by our PSAs with saving lives. CISA maintains an exercise program that provides effective and practical mechanisms to identify areas for improvement, evaluate and implement corrective actions, and share best practices through discussion-based and full-scale exercises. These scenarios are driven by the public and private sector and often focus on active shooter, vehicle ramming, chemical security, and bombing prevention. In view of the attacks against faith-based communities in April 2019, CISA partnered with the Secure Community Network, SCAN, to conduct a tabletop exercise with the Jewish community leaders from across the United States, law enforcement personnel, and interagency officials to work through how a community will share information and what actions they should take during a security event. Throughout the history of our nation, the United States has epitomized the truest definition of a great democracy and has demonstrated to the world the value of freedom. And this is clearly seen in the right to practice a religion of choice. However, those freedoms that have made this country a shining city upon a hill do not come without a price. As I wrote to the faith-based community a little over a year ago, in this dynamic threat environment, we face the reality that differences in ideology can result in attacks even in the most holy of places. While this unfortunate truth may be a reality, it does not have to be inevitable. The threat is not going away, but neither is our determination to reduce the probability of a successful attack. The department is committed to maintaining a strong relationship with the faith-based community to reduce risk where we can, mitigate impacts where we must, and always defend today to secure tomorrow. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. I will remind the subcommittee that we will each have 5 minutes to question the panel. I'll now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assistant Secretary Elizabeth Newman, I'd like to start with you. Anti-Semitism is rising around the world. I think you even addressed that a little bit. We need to figure out how to stop this hateful trend. I asked our last panel of witnesses that I referred to a little earlier in my statement, about a month ago, this question, and I'm interested to see your assessment. What are you seeing in Europe and elsewhere in terms of anti-Semitic rhetoric and violence, and how has this contributed to the rise of anti-Semitism here in the United States?
Sir, I will invite also AD Sanborn to join me in this because the FBI does a lot more of the intelligence investigations than I do in my role. But I can tell you from the work that my team does and talking to our partners overseas that our European allies are very concerned about what they're seeing. There are a number of summits that are planned for next month to discuss how to wrestle with the same issues that we're wrestling with here. It is transnational. It is rising in Europe. And increasingly everybody's talking to one another and sharing ideas and how to get around our law enforcement and terrorism tools.
I was going to the Assistant Director. Would you mind answering the same question?
Just to add to what Ms. Newman said, the Jewish community across the world is definitely vulnerable, not just in regard, though, I would highlight to domestic terrorism, but also international terrorism. If you remember back, and I think I mentioned this in my statement for the record, in 2016, we actually arrested, JTF did, an individual who was planning to attack a Jewish center in Florida on behalf of ISIS. In 2018, we had 2 individuals who were surveilling Jewish facilities to do attacks potentially on behalf of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And then later on in December of 2018, the JTF in Ohio arrested an individual for identifying 2 different synagogues that he wanted to attack. And so the vulnerability, obviously, of the Jewish community is concerning, and it's across both spectrums of the
Well, let's stay there. Let's unpack that a little bit then. Anti-Semitic attacks and incidents in New York and New Jersey, we've seen them increase. But we've also seen that it comes from a wide variety of ideologies. Is that fair to say?
Totally fair to say. I think
Well, what do you, I mean, let me ask the question here. This is what I'd like you to just, what do you attribute the spread of anti-Semitism from so many of these ideological drivers?
that's a great question, and I think you heard from the earlier panel in session 1. What's behind each individual's ideology and motivation and eventual decision to attack is complex and incredibly complex, and we're seeing a mixture of ideologies, and so peeling back exactly what that is and what drove them to that is incredibly difficult. I think both Ms. Newman and I commented in our opening statements about the behavior and focusing on the indicators and warning signs that somebody might mobilize is where we see our most productive, successful effort.
Okay. Earlier this month, as I mentioned, FBI Director Wray testified that the Bureau has elevated racially motivated violent extremism to an equal priority with homegrown violent extremism and Islamist terrorism. Assistant Director, have new directives been issued to the JTTFs and the FBI field offices, and what type of resources are dedicated to all these new priorities?
Another great question. So every year we go through our threat prioritization process at headquarters and out in the field. And by the director doing that, that sets the stage for how the field should respond to that. And so that definitely is something that every field office reacts to. I can tell you in Minnesota, I mimicked exactly what you heard the director say. I have a hate crimes DT fusion cell in Minnesota, created that to mimic that. I think to highlight the resources, I would like to bring up a significant arrest that we had today.
Sure.
Sort of mention to you, this is how we respond to those things. So today we arrested 5 members of the Adam Waffen Division across 4 different states. And why I bring that up is I think it's important for you to understand every single person in the FBI is going to work a threat when we have a threat. We had individuals who were involved in an intimidation campaign to put personalized messages on journalists and members of our Jewish community to intimidate them and potentially act out in violence. And when that happens, in those 4 states, every single person in those field offices working that arrest today. Whether they're a fugitive agent or a counterterrorism agent, they're working that arrest today.
Just a quick yes or no as my time expires here. Thank you for that information, and I can even see your passion behind this a little bit. It sparks up a little bit there. Just a quick yes or no question. Do you feel like the directives that are getting are more than just what's on white paper, but these are actually being implemented along the way?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You'll back.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. We'll now move on to the esteemed gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to take part in this hearing. Ms. Newman, it's been a pleasure to work with you over the last several months. I want to thank you again personally for coming to my district and helping us spread the word among our faith community about the resources that are available to them. I want to start with you, because as you know, one success that we have had recently is that we've worked together here to restore a significant amount of funding that was previously cut from a variety of DHS Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention programs. And I wanted you to tell us in as concrete and straightforward terms possible what you are now able to do now that you have this new funding that you were not able to do before, how that will help, And what lessons has DHS learned from previous iterations of this program to make sure that we are effectively honing our efforts on where the threat is coming from right now, in accordance with the strategy you all put out?
Thank you, Congressman. I too have enjoyed the partnership and everyone on this committee's support for our efforts. I'm going to start with your last question, because I think it helps frame where we are today, the lessons learned. A couple of years ago, as you alluded to, the funding for this effort was reduced in large part because we were going through administration transitions, and the work that had been initiated was towards the end of an administration and not properly codified in a variety of mechanisms, getting things into budgets, making sure that there was appropriate policy documentation to say what we were trying to achieve, the expected outcomes, et cetera. One of the things that we looked to do when we were studying where does the prevention mission need to go, we first started with RAND, our FFRDC, and asked them to go look at the problem set, because there were criticisms from multiple angles. You're targeting communities to this is pseudoscience, it doesn't actually work. RAND went out and studied, they came back, they said prevention does work. It's underfunded. Here's where you need more money. And it needs to be locally based. You need to focus your efforts on equipping, empowering, informing the local communities, the local government to be able to conduct prevention efforts. So that gave us a framing, and from that we started talking to you all. And we started articulating a vision for where we wanted to go with prevention, acknowledging the mistakes of the past few years and looking forward to trying to build a better path forward. And I'm very pleased that because of those conversations with you, with your staff, that what is represented in this document here, Goal 3, that it is all about prevention. It redefines what prevention means. As many of you know, post 9/11, prevention was the imminent threat, stop the bomb from going off. Now prevention is much farther left of boom, working with individuals well before they contemplate an act of violence, trying to build resilience into society, and then as somebody is on that pathway to violence, trying to intervene before they've crossed that criminal threshold. Because of the funding that you have given us, the concrete answers, we're able to put 12 field staff in the field this year. We're going to be developing baseline capabilities for how you do prevention correctly to make sure we have proper protections in place for civil liberties as well as privacy, and as well as having the right handshake with law enforcement, with the FBI, so that if somebody does not successfully work through an intervention and off-ramp, that law enforcement is called in appropriately to disrupt. We're going to be able to engage with more stakeholders, especially the technology community. I think this is a space, as your earlier panels alluded to, that we need to have more conversations and see if we can be doing more to combat terrorist use of the internet. So that's just a snapshot of what we are currently working on, but there's much more to be done.
Thank you. Very, very quickly, I don't have much time left. Ms. Sanborn, you mentioned the arrests of the Atomwaffen Division members. What are they being charged with? If it's a campaign of intimidation? Because we're thinking about legal authorities and whether you have sufficient
Absolutely.
authorities.
I don't have the specific charges in front of me. I do remember that some of them involved the transmission of threats across interstate lines, wire communication, and whatnot. So typical tools we use in our toolbox.
Right. But we still can't charge someone with material support
Correct.
for the
They're not
Atomwaffen
charged.
Division. Right. Got it. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. We will move on to someone who has spent her entire career fighting this fight. Ms. Slotkin from the great state of Michigan.
He's just trying to make up for the fact that he let Mr. Malinowski go first. Thank you for being here. The context for my questions is that I'm from Michigan, and in my district specifically, we've seen in the very recent past a real uptick in anti-Semitic incidents. We've had our Michigan State University Hillel defaced this fall. We had a swastika painted in front of a fraternity house in the past month. We had a mezuzah pulled off one of our dorm or one of our students' locations. And then in one of my counties across basically an entire town, we woke up up one morning and it had anti-Semitic graffiti in front of multiple businesses saying Jews are responsible for 9/11. So in response to this uptick, not just in my district, but across the state, we've had synagogues defaced, including in Hancock, Michigan, where a man from New Jersey put out a call and said, kind of, you should move against synagogues. And in Michigan and in Wisconsin, people responded and defaced synagogues. I held a meeting this past Sunday on anti-Semitism in my community in East Lansing, Michigan. My attorney general was there, and we spent a lot of time answering questions, concerns from community members on what to do about this. So my experience in my life is in countering foreign terrorism and the foreign threats. And I know that after 9/11, especially in the FBI, it took a minute to adjust to these different threats. I remember when we turned a lot of support staff at the FBI into analysts on terrorism overnight. I remember how we weren't resourced because the threat had fundamentally changed. So if I can just ask, Ms. Sanborn, can you tell me in specific terms what you've changed on number of analysts, number of dollars, number of agents, number of task force? I get that you guys are focused on it and I'm thrilled, but I know after 15 years in the government, it's dollars and people. Convince me, as Mr. Rose said, that we're taking the threat seriously.
What I can tell you is the number of resources that we throw at that is commensurate with what we're seeing with the problem. So, for example, 1/5 of my CT cases are the racially or ethnically motivated cases. And so 1/5 of my resources are applied to that. So it's commensurate with what we're seeing as far as the cases and the threat and the amount of resources that we put forth to it. I believe that the creation of things like the Hate Crimes Fusion Center, the other thing that we have done is we've cross-pollinated some of those people that you reflect in your career. The long-time good international terrorism analysts and/or agents are cross-pollinating into the domestic terrorism space to sort of make sure we're passing on best practices and lessons learned. And interestingly enough, the JTTF, which is one of our best tools in our toolbox, was actually created in 1980 in response to domestic terrorism in New York with the increase of attacks there.
So what I would ask, because I think there's a lot of folks who might be interested in this, is that you take that question for the record and provide kind of in concrete dollars and bodies what we're talking about. It's great that one area is commensurate with the threat, but I think a lot of us would be able to speak to our constituents with real authority if we said, look, here's what the FBI had their resources, here's how they had them allocated in 2016, and here's what they are today. A comparative to show us the delta would be great. If I can just move on to Assistant Secretary Newman. So I guess the question I have is, in your experience, once we identify that these networks are out there, that there's communities, particularly online, that may be mobilizing or dealing in conspiracy theories, recruiting, those kinds of things, tell me about rehabilitation. Tell me about how you deal with this. I understand prevention, and obviously that's the goal. But just like with foreign terrorists, right, with people who have been radicalized, what is the rehab process once we identify a community? What can you recommend to people who are concerned about the growing spike in anti-Semitic attacks?
I will start with the honest answer, which is I think we're still learning. And from your experience overseas, you know that there are a number of other governments that have been struggling with this for a long time. They don't have some of the restrictions we do. They try a variety of things, and the jury's still out whether it really works. It's very hard to say that once somebody's fully radicalized, mobilized to violence, committed that act, that you're going to have much success off-ramping them, if you will. So the recidivism problem is one that we're really concerned about. I don't think that means we're without hope, and I'm sure A.D. Sanborn has some interesting experience on this too. But I do think we need more research and we need to study. So one of the things that we are doing with the grant funds that you all have provided us is we're ensuring that there's room for innovation for NGOs, nonprofits, things that maybe government is not best equipped to do, to try new things, try something new in this space, since we're all still kind of learning what works and what doesn't. We're also bringing our Science and Technology Directorate alongside those grantees to study. the effectiveness, the outcome. I'm okay if we give money to a grantee, they try something and it fails. I just want to know that it failed so we don't refund it or other people don't try to pass on that practice. So I think we need more research in that space. I think we need to invite more of the technology sector and academia to the table, things that we thought were working, for example, in counter messaging. We're now seeing some evidence that maybe it doesn't work as well as we thought a couple of years ago. So data here is really important to make sure that as we're trying new things, that we genuinely understand if it is having that long-term impact. I feel much more confident in what the science is telling us or the research is telling us on that far left of boom, being able to intervene before somebody really has idealized and come up with the plan. Once somebody has carried out an attack, that space, and that DOJ does a lot of studies in this space, more so than DHS, but that space we know is a tougher nut to crack. It is in our strategy. It's one, as we're building our implementation plan, I see us taking on in probably another fiscal year or two, because we want to build the local prevention framework capability first, so that as somebody's coming out of prison, they might be able to leverage that capability more effectively, and recognizing DOJ also has strong responsibilities in this space.
Thank you. I think my time has expired.
We'll do another round of questions after this. Ms. Sanborn, I want to lean in on this arrest that was made earlier today. Based off your understanding, specifically looking at Ram, Atomwaffen, and the Base, 3 leading domestic neo-Nazi organizations, what are their global connections? Who are they going to work with, communicating with, exchanging money with? Paint the picture of this global movement, please.
I can't get into the specifics on this specific case because the investigation is obviously ongoing, but I will tell you that that is one of the things that we are doing all the time. For example, you probably saw the attacks in Germany this week. And so we're trying to take those attacks overseas or disruptions here and build out global networks working with our foreign partners.
Okay, well, so you look at Atomwaffen, for instance. Sonnenkrieg in Britain is technically an offshoot of Atomwaffen. Sonnenkrieg, just several weeks ago, was labeled a terrorist organization by the UK. So this is something that is clear. It's almost obvious at this point. If Atomwaffen were ISIS or Al-Qaeda, and those 4 individuals had sent these menacing messages, anti-Semitic in nature and otherwise, what would you have charged? What would you be charging them with?
Not speaking for the United States Attorney, but if they were supporting a foreign terrorist organization and they were designated, we would have the potential for the 2339, the foreign material support to a foreign.
Providing them material support. What would you be? What additional powers would you have in terms of surveillance and generally in terms of your law enforcement capabilities? Again, if Atomwaffen were ISIS or Al-Qaeda and they had chapters here in America?
That's a complicated, I think, 2-part process, right? So the charge is separate from our authorities and what we would need to predicate a case. And so while the charge is definitely a great tool in the toolbox to add charges on, we, according to our policies and procedures, to predicate a case in the domestic terrorism space, you would still need those things that we have right now, which is somebody who's looking to commit a criminal act, conduct violence in furtherance of their ideology to coerce. So it wouldn't help us predicate a case just because we had a statute.
Sure, but again, with that providing material support, based off your experience, looking at the charges that these 4 Atomwaffen members will likely face versus providing material support, how, in terms of the severity, how different are they in terms of the average amount of time that they'll spend behind prison, behind bars, so on and so forth?
Material support exposure is definitely greater than what these 3
And I understand you're speaking in generalities, but how much greater?
I don't remember specifically what the exposure is on 2339, but in the press conference with the United States Attorney and the SAC out in Seattle, these guys are looking at about 5 years.
Atomwaffen.
The ones we disrupted today, correct.
They're looking at about 5 years. Now, if they were ISIS, Al-Qaeda, providing material support to a foreign terrorist organization, correct me if I'm wrong, they're looking at closer to life.
Correct, you'd have an extra charge. I will say that one of the things that they are doing in this case, and you'll find this in many cases, is they start off with a one charge, and then as the case progresses, they will add further charges on. So I would not be surprised if in the coming days you don't see the Western District of Washington add charges on to these individuals, so their exposure could get higher.
But the charge that is not available to them right now is exactly the one you just laid out, providing material support to a foreign terrorist organization, because our State Department has been unwilling to label global neo-Nazi organizations as foreign terrorist organizations, despite the fact that countries like Canada and the UK have already done so, despite the fact that if you look at the conflict in Crimea, 20,000 foreign fighters have gone to already fight in that conflict in just the last 5 years, double the number that went to go fight in Afghanistan during the entirety of that conflict in the 80s. Ms. Newman, you mentioned tracking foreign fighters, both foreign fighters coming into America as well as American citizens or legal residents going to fight and then coming back. Are you telling us here that you have enough powers, that the federal government has enough power right now and authority to identify every legal resident, American citizen, as well as person attempting to come into America who has participated in the conflict in Crimea or been a part of a global neo-Nazi organization?
What I can say is that we're working on it, but no, I don't have confidence that we would be able to track everyone.
Do you have confidence that we're able to track those participating with jihadist organizations?
I have better confidence, yes.
Why do you have better confidence?
We've been working at it longer, and as Congresswoman Slotkin pointed out, it does take a while for us to figure when we're doing something new and the authorities are different, what we're allowed to do, what are the parameters, and how.
Why are the authorities different?
When you have a designated terrorist organization like ISIS, we are able to do certain things with our screening and vetting tools that in a context of not having a designated organization, we have to be careful to make sure that when we're tracking somebody or denying somebody admissibility that it adheres to the law. If you are a member of a foreign terrorist organization, period, hard stop, you don't get to come in. If you are not, but you're associated with a violent extremist group, but they're not designated, we have to do more work to justify that inadmissibility.
So what I'm hearing from you is because, again, we are unwilling to label these organizations as FTOs, we cannot say with certainty, the same level of certainty that we can say for jihadist organizations, that we can track those coming in, as well as legal residents and American citizens who go and then come back. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I want to look at social media. How has your partnership been with social media companies thus far in addressing the issue of counterterrorism? And let's actually do all three, because I think all three of you are affected by this.
Sure,
Yeah,
Mr.
You want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Mr. Chair, I don't mind going first. CISA works with our social media companies quite often. Mostly it is centered around disinformation and foreign influence. But as the strategic framework has started to point out, we are starting to gravitate resources and ask the right questions of our social media companies now as it relates to really the connection between foreign influence and the radicalization that is highlighted in the DHS framework. I think from a resource perspective, I'd love to circle back on Congresswoman Slotkin's question from earlier. The resources are really driven from the demand signal from industry. And so right now, faith-based organizations, particularly the Jewish organizations that reside throughout this country, are asking these very key questions of, DHS, you've done these really great things over the last 15 years. They're very high level. They're at 45,000 feet. We need some very specific things surrounding what to do when an intruder comes into our church, synagogue, mosque, temple. Can you get more specific? And so what we have done over the last number of years is to try and drill down to what does run, hide, fight really mean? What are some of the basic protective measures that a church or synagogue should actually implement that are low cost or no cost that people can do today? So a lot of our products and services that we're pushing out today have a lot of that flavor. And I think today we are in a better position to provide subject matter expertise in the field where the constituents reside to make them a more secure campus, or in this case, a more secure church, synagogue, mosque, or temple. And we do this through the PSA program. I mentioned that earlier in my opening statement. We have 119 PSAs, and quite frankly, we probably need 119 more. The demand signal, again, is just off the charts. These are GS 14s and 15s that are out in the field, kind of the tip of the spear, that are able to walk the property, understand what that enemy avenue of approach is, understand what the gaps in security might be, and where to make those investments. And so this is really from an investment and resource perspective where I think DHS and CISA is trying to gravitate towards now.
On social media, we, as I mentioned in my testimony, we do work with the big companies primarily through the Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism.
Who do you work with at the Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism?
So the founding partners were Facebook, Twitter, Google, and Microsoft.
Who's your point of contact?
They are, well, so GiveCT as an entity is in the process of turning itself into a nonprofit.
Right.
So as they are standing that up,
Because we yelled at them because it was a shell of an organization with no points of contact. So
it was a rotating chair.
they had no points of contact. They had no budget. They had no SOP. They had nothing. So my question is that when you work with social media companies to address the issue of counterterrorism, who do you call?
So if it's law enforcement, that would be in the Bureau's lane, so I'll let A.D. Sanborn describe that. On the nature of how do you take down terrorist content, voluntary approach that the U.S. government uses, best practices for counter-messaging, we're using the points of contact at the GiveCT. I personally don't know the names of those, but my staff...
So you send an email to 5 people?
No, they're in the process of hiring an executive director, is my understanding. And
Yeah,
I'm
I know.
happy to take that as a get back with the precise, here is how often that we're talking to them. But I know that
We're very interested to know how this actually happens.
Sure.
Because I've been hearing people brag about the GiveCT now for more than a year, and right now the thing does not exist. It's not real. All it is a share drive of hashtags. That's all it is. It doesn't exist. So we really want to understand how this works.
Sure.
And we have yet to get a real answer. Terrorism is terrorism. Take it all down. But this is big business here. Mm-hmm. The GiveCT does not exist yet. So we cannot, that is not a suitable answer yet as to what your operational procedures are to address social media companies. Ms. Sanborn?
We spend a good chunk of our energy and resources in my division and across the Bureau. I have a strategic partnership engagement section that tries to focus on strategic partners in general, which includes social media, in education and capacity building, trying to really make them aware of what the threat is so that they can be very mindful when they develop and enforce their terms of use, for example. Also very encouraged by their response when we serve them lawful process. So both in an education and capacity building, the better aware they are of the threat, the more...
And you're confident that they treat neo-Nazi organizations in the same manner that they treat jihadist terrorist organizations?
I'm encouraged by their interest to learn from that from us.
Okay. All right. For our next round, we'll move back to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Newman, the Homeland Security Advisory Council Subcommittee on Faith-Based Security released a report in mid-December with a number of recommendations. One that stood out to me was that there is an information gap between faith-based groups and state and locally owned fusion centers. The reason why I was a pastor for 16 years during the time that we began to build our own security teams, trying to even go as far as process information to see if there were any potential threats out there. So my question is, does DHS have any initiatives to expand information sharing and as well training available to fusion centers and DHS personnel deployed around the U.S. to fill this gap?
Thank you for the question, Chairman. I'm actually going to answer a part of this and pass it over to Mr. Harrell. We are in the process of finalizing our implementing recommendations coming out of that HSAC report. What we took their commentary about fusion centers and connecting with churches, we kind of examined that and had some conversations with the HSAC chairs, Mr. Goldenberg, Mr. Allen, and we're trying to understand the problem that they were describing I think one of the challenges is that fusion centers are different in each state. Their original purpose was information sharing between and among local government and up to the federal government. They were not necessarily designed to be outreach mechanisms to their community. Now, some fusion centers have taken on that mandate, and that's great. New Jersey is a great example of this, where they have they physically go out and do trainings and conduct exercises and educate their communities about the threat. I think that's wonderful, but I don't think all fusion centers are designed that way. They really are about intelligence analysis and information sharing. So this leads me to, as we were assessing, there is a problem here. We like to call it the last mile problem. The federal government's apparatuses are not designed to get to all, tens of thousands of houses of worship in this country.
And let me pause just for a second, and I appreciate the eloquent response there. But if there is a concern, even remotely, for a synagogue or a church in a specific area, does not these fusion centers, the federal government, have some responsibility to bring these folks in to say, hey, it's just small on the radar, just wanted you to know, as opposed to putting the burden on the church or synagogue, the rabbi, the pastor, the cleric, whatever it might be, to pursue this information?
Yes. What I was trying to get to is that we haven't had to do that before, so we're trying to figure out the best way to do it.
Okay.
So I think there is a role for fusion centers. There's a huge role for state and local law enforcement, and our protective security advisors are in some ways much better equipped than perhaps a fusion center might be to make sure that they're getting that information out. But it's tens of thousands of houses of worship that need to be trained and educated. There's not enough manpower in a fusion center or PSA apparatus to do that. So we're going to have to come up with a slightly different model than what we have used heretofore.
Mr. Harrell, you want to add something to that?
Please, and thank you, sir. With the 80-plus fusion centers that we have in this country, that is one belly button. The additional belly button would be the Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or the ISACs. And these are the major channels of communication back and forth between the federal government, state and local partners, and then ultimately industry, churches, synagogues, mosques, et cetera. But you don't know what you don't know. And I think at some point there needs to be a better information sharing campaign to say these resources exist. This information is being shared on a daily, weekly, monthly basis in terms of threats in near real time. And it's difficult, as Assistant Secretary Newman just mentioned, it's difficult to get to every church. But we need to ensure that through this mechanism, people are landing on distribution lists across this country to get this information into the hands of people that can actually do something about it. I think through the PSA program, we've tried to bridge some of those gaps, but it's difficult to get to some of the rural communities. It's difficult to get to some of the lesser served populations. But that is our goal. That is what we are trying to do. That's what we're gravitating.
Let me switch gears just for a second. Stay with you, Mr. Harrell. The CISA Protective Security Advisor Program has been getting a lot of attention recently and additional responsibilities related to community outreach. How many PSAs are there, and what are their primary responsibilities? What new responsibilities will they have under the new TVTP initiative? And I'll throw this in there since I've just got a few seconds to touch on it what you can. Does this strain your resources for other missions under CISA?
We have 119 PSAs, Congressman, and as I mentioned earlier, we need a whole lot more. This is one of the things that we have asked for in future budgets, and I'm confident that's where we will end up going as an organization. The demand signal ultimately comes through these PSAs. They are the field resources. They are the ones that eat, breathe, sleep, and reside in these communities. They have the relationships with the local community, the churches, the schools, the big communities that are out there, critical infrastructure owners and operators, and their whole goal really at the end of the day is capacity building and bringing relationships to bear, having the right people sit at the table to understand what the risk is, how to drive down risk, and ultimately, what resources does the federal government have that we could put into the community today to drive down risk and make people a harder target. Many of these resources are low cost, no cost. I would say the majority of them are absolutely free. But again, people don't know what they don't know, and so it is our opportunity, it's our challenge to get this information out. I can point to a website all day. But at the end of the day, we need to help people along to get them the right information.
It is your challenge, your opportunity, and I would even add, hopefully, responsibility as well.
Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you. I want to start with the social media question, and I want you all to imagine the following hypothetical scenario. An American company reaches out to leaders of the base or the Atomwaffen division or another terrorist group and says, have we got a great service for you? We will scour the entire internet, using big data for anybody in the world who might be susceptible to your message. And so long as you don't post things that are overtly threatening violence, we're willing to deliver your message directly into the social media of those people, wherever they may be, to help you recruit more members and to spread your message more effectively. Would you be concerned about that?
Very.
Isn't that exactly what Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and the big social media companies in fact do via their social media algorithms? Now, they may not physically pick up the phone and call the Atomwaffen division and say, this is a great service for you, but isn't that effectively what the social media algorithms do? They scour the internet for anybody who, based on their previous internet usage, seems like the sort of person who would like to buy a pair of shoes, watch a cute kitten video, or perhaps be interested in anti-Semitic or neo-Nazi content and make that connection.
Yes, I am not going to sit here and defend companies. That's not my job. And your point, Mr. Chairman, was well taken. That said, I do think that the briefings I have received, they are trying. Are they trying hard enough? I think that's for you all to examine. But
have you ever, in your engagement with them, though, directly addressed this issue of how their algorithms help to spread this kind of content?
I can tell you that there are any number of former counterterrorism professionals that work for these companies that are actively trying to figure out how to stop this. Okay. If they're moving fast enough, if there's enough money towards that, that's a separate question. I have not examined that. But I do know that the people that I have met with that brief me on their innovative tools to try to promote civil discourse, to try to appropriately remove content that violates their terms of service, that tries to identify that content which is spreading hate. They are looking for ways to do that within the context of
right. So
their...
clearly, if they see something bad, they take it down, but the engine that causes that stuff to spread is something I think they are more reluctant to acknowledge and address. Different question for you, Ms. Sanborn. We were talking about various legal authorities. We had a case in New Jersey recently, a man in Camden County, New Jersey, who had a long history of posting anti-Semitic rants on the internet, including celebrating acts of violence against Jews. Allegedly, he was in personal contact with the shooter in the Tree of Life synagogue. And because we have, in New Jersey, recently passed a so-called red flag law enforcement in New Jersey was able to confiscate this individual's firearms, of which he had quite a few. In your experience as a law enforcement officer, do you think this is an authority that is useful in these circumstances where somebody has not yet committed an act of violence, but there is this body of evidence that they may be celebrating, contemplating, engaging with people who have committed such acts? Is that a useful tool for law enforcement to have, in your view?
I think what would concern me about sort of thinking that solves the problem is, in my experience as a law enforcement officer, if an individual is intent on doing some harm, they're going to find a weapon, and unfortunately, all of our terrorism, international and domestic, is encouraging individuals to make a weapon. I mean, the threat we've seen in Europe of vehicular attacks is equally as scary as the threat that we can imagine when you talk about firearms. And they're telling them, go get a knife, go get a vehicle. And so I'm not sure that necessarily, it could falsely give us the sense of security.
But can it help? I'm not suggesting it solves the problem.
Anytime a bad guy doesn't have a weapon in their hands, it's a positive sign.
Thank you. I yield back.
I want to close out just by again looking at this issue of social media. Ms. Sanborn, would you agree that one of the most significant threats we face today when it comes to terrorism is that of a self-radicalized lone gunman, lone gunwoman, or lone perpetrator who hasn't traveled to a terrorist camp, hasn't necessarily even moved overseas.
Correct, the lone offender is our greatest threat.
And they're often radicalized online, correct? So we have that. We all agree that that's a threat. And now, Ms. Newman, you just said something that I found interesting. We don't yet know, correct, whether social media companies are fulfilling their responsibilities to adhere fully to their own codes of conduct. Right now, it doesn't seem like we have a metric or a system in place to say they've done it 90% of the time or 95% of the time. Is that correct?
I think so. I'll also take that as a get back to confirm that we don't have metrics in place. And I've been in conversations where they've been discussing how to measure. They measure right now in terms of amount of content taken down,
Sure.
how quickly they intervene in content before it even uploads. But I think you're getting at a slightly different type of metric.
Yeah, what I'm trying to get at is that we don't have, the public sector right now, we have no system in place to measure how well they are doing something, which we all collectively agree is one of, if not our greatest or most likely terrorist threats. We're in essence relying on them we have to take them at their word. Now, we don't do that for airbag deployability. We don't do that for all of these other public health, public safety concerns that we as society have agreed upon. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
So what I would urge you all, and we're going to have continued discussions about this, we are proposing something called Raise the Bar Act, which would be an innovative public-private partnership between DHS and the social media companies, particularly those engaged in GIFT-CT, when they stand it up and make it a real organization, to, on a quarterly basis, issue a report, engage in a partnership with a university and trusted flaggers to see how well they do at taking terrorist content off of their platforms. But the last point here is we have to get them to agree that Atomwaffen and the base and Sonnenkrieg and Blood and Honor and National Action and so many others are actually terrorists. And in order to do that, we need you all to call them that. We need the State Department to label at least some of them FTOs. So I'll leave it to you if you all have any reaction to what I just said, and then we can close it out. We'll start with you, Ms. Sanborn.
I think we would welcome the participation about the conversation with the State Department. We would be happy to feed our intelligence into them and allow them to evaluate what we have to see if it helps them make a decision.
Thank you.
I've really struggled with this, several of the questions you've been raising, Mr. Chairman, especially since we talked a couple of weeks ago. And I've, in truth, been struggling with this for the 2 years that I've been in my position. I think that what you're raising deserves robust debate, and I think it deserves probably more due diligence than somebody in my role with multiple responsibilities and, quite frankly, one hearing can do. I think there are two particular issues you've drawn out. The first is the way in which online platforms catalyze hate. I think Mr. Goldenberg in his past panel with you gave you a great example of situations that are just absolutely abhorrent, of a rabbi whose children were targeted online. And I'm very encouraged by Aideen Sanborn to see that they are looking to try to use all the tools that they currently have to try to go after such horrible, horrible things. But the fact is that our law enforcement community feels hamstrung. And how do you go after and balance First Amendment rights to free speech, while at the same time, how do you not acknowledge that innocent children being projected with images online that will forever be online, what about their rights? And so there's that tension there. And then we also know that we have these organizations or movements or individuals that some of them are very sophisticated. They know exactly how far they can go. They're training their people to say you can go this far but not any farther. They are being sophisticated in both their communications and in their messaging. So they are playing a game, and we are not equipped to go after that game effectively because of the rules that we are using that were, quite frankly, designed 50 years ago. So I think it's probably time to take a fresh look. We do regulate other parts of speech over airwaves. It's hard for me to understand why on the online side we're not willing to look at that. And then the second thing you raised about domestic terrorist groups and movements being designated, I think it's definitely worth looking at whether we need a new DTO designation or movement designation, or maybe just relook at the whole entire framework. The national security apparatus is designed for a threat from 20, 30 years ago, and the world is changing. And every counterterrorism professional I speak to in the federal government and overseas feels like we are at the doorstep of another 9/11, maybe not something that catastrophic in terms of the visual or the numbers, but that we can see it building and we don't quite know how to stop it. And so this feels like one of those moments where having smart people, academics, lawyers, people that can appreciate that we as a country have abused authority in the past, McCarthyism, internment of Japanese during World War II. We don't have a great track record here. We need to do this wisely, and it probably is not in our normal course of business. It feels like this is a time for some sort of bipartisan commission to go off and study this problem and come back with a holistic view of this. So I applaud your championing. Happy to work with you on your legislation because I will take whatever we can get to go after this problem, but I also think we need a bigger conversation on this.
Mr. Chairman, thank you again for having us. Based off of current events and the frequency of events, I am convinced that this country is becoming more and more violent every single day. And I am unique up here in that I sit in a position where we are focused within CISA on preparedness and protection. I live my life as if the worst day is right around the corner. And I think I've mentioned this to you in the past. And so we need to ensure that we have the resources in our fingertips, and they can't reside in our fingertips. They have to go out into the field where they can be used to reduce risk and ultimately save lives. So in terms of marshaling resources, budget, the things that we have within the department, we need to ensure that they are well known. There's an education campaign that DHS has these things, and I think we're moving in this direction now.
Great. Thank you all so much again, and thank you for all your service to this country. I know you live with an incredible amount of stress and pressure, and people are often only focusing on you when something doesn't go well. So thank you for everything that you're doing for this great country. I would also ask unanimous consent for a statement from the Jewish Federations of North America to be entered into the record without objection, so ordered. And thank you for their extraordinary contribution. With that, I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.